Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome once again to DawahWise. Today we'll take a deep dive and look into one of the arguments presented by a popular Christian apologist in the internet and explore the problems associated with the arguments presented. Let's start with the argument itself from the apologist.
That Abraham wasn't delivered from a fire. It never happened. And in the comments section, someone, I thought it was a Muslim, asked, how do you know that Abraham was not thrown into the fire? And here's my response. Because we know where the story came from. The story of God delivering Abraham from a fire was found in the Jewish Talmud, but it was based on a mistranslation of Genesis 15. In Genesis 15:7, God says to Abraham, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. Notice the word Ur in this verse, which is a Babylonian word that means city and was the name of a particular city. In the 1st century, a Jewish rabbi named Jonathan ben Uziel was translating Genesis 15 into Aramaic, and he came across the word Ur. Jonathan knew Hebrew, but he didn't know Babylonian. So he confused the Babylonian word Ur, which means city, with the Hebrew word Ur, which means fire. This mistake caused him to mistranslate the passage. Instead of saying that God delivered Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldeans, i.e. the ancient city of Ur, which Abraham left to travel to the land God had promised him, Jonathan's mistranslation said that God delivered Abraham out of the fire of the Chaldeans. Later writers expanded on this story of Abraham being miraculously delivered from a fire, but these later versions can all be traced back to a mistranslation of Genesis 15. And this story, which was popular among the Jews of Arabia, ended up in both the Quran and the Hadith, even though it was based on a mistranslation.
Right. So we've heard from the mouth of the apologist what exactly the problem is with the Quranic passage. And inshallah, in this video, I will explore deeply by doing some fact checks what the problems are with the arguments presented. So let's first understand what he's saying. Quran mentions Ibrahim alayhi salam, or Abraham, who's rescued from the fire. And the story apparently of Ibrahim alayhi salam being rescued from the fire is not found in the Bible. So it is argued by the Christians that this is a legendary story rather than a true ancient history. And instead it's a Jewish midrashic legend that developed in this form sometime after the period of the New Testament. This legend does not appear until post-exilic Judaism, where Aramaic is the dominant language. That's where the argument goes. It is also said that the most detailed of this account, the pre-Islamic version, appears in Midrash Rabbah Genesis, which is this account here on this screen. Other critics mention that the earliest form of this legend appears in the apocryphal Book of Jubilees, probably written sometime during the 4th to the 2nd centuries BC. Before that time, there is no hint of this narrative in any Jewish or Israelite writings. They say the name of Abraham's original home is Ur of the Chaldeans. The city name Ur, however, has the same consonantal structure as a Hebrew word for light that in Aramaic means fire. Thus, when some Aramaic interpreters approached the text, instead of Ur of the Chaldeans, they read fire of the Chaldeans. So Ur is mistranslated according to them, or rather translated as fire in Midrash Rabbah Genesis, in the Aramaic Targum of Pseudo Jonathan, and Midrash Perk de Eliezer. It is alleged that this story in fact came from a mistake in understanding the Babylonian text when translating and interpreting it from Hebrew to Aramaic by a Jewish exegete called Jonathan Ben Uziel. So where did Mr. Wood get this story based on a mistake in reading from? It's from no other than another J. Smith, who says, we have evidence that a Jewish scribe named Jonathan Ben Uziel mistook the Hebrew word or for the Hebrew word which means fire. Thus, in his commentary of the verse, he writes, I am the Lord who brought you out of the fire of the Chaldeans. Okay, so that's where the argument is. What I will show, God willing, bi'iznillah, is that this argument or criticism against the Quranic story by Wood and others is full of holes, based on circular reasoning, appealing only to emotions. It is historically incorrect, and instead arguably questionable on its own historicity and accuracy of the biblical narrative that it supposedly rests on. So I'm going to first outline the problems with this argument, and then secondly clarify the Quranic narrative on the basis of biblical, extra-biblical, religious, secular, historical, and archaeological data demonstrating the veracity of the Quranic data on the subject. So let's look at first the Quranic story. This is what the Quran says about Ibrahim a.s. being rescued from the fire. So let us now start to outline the problems one by one of this argument. Problem number one, Jonathan did not mistranslate. He didn't even translate the book of Genesis. The story is a concoction, a fabrication made up by Wood or his source, J. Smith or others. Jonathan Ben Uziel was a pupil of Hillel, the famous rabbinic sage of the 1st century BCE to 1st century CE. He wrote a Targum to the prophets. It is clear there is no connection between Jonathan and the Aramaic translation of the Pentateuch, at first called Targum Eretz Israel and Targum Yerushalmi. It was erroneously attributed to Jonathan Ben Uziel from the 14th century because the initials, the Hebrew initials, were taken to refer to Targum Jonathan instead of Targum Yerushalmi, Palestinian Targum. Because of the printer's mistake, it was later labeled Targum Jonathan in reference to Jonathan Ben Uziel. The Talmud itself relates that Jonathan Ben Uziel, a student of Hillel, fashioned an Aramaic translation of prophets. The irony, the scribal mistranslation David is building his argument on is something he himself instead is guilty and victim of, because Jonathan Ben Uziel did not even write a commentary on Genesis. It was a printing mistake in the 14th century that led people to believe he actually translated it. Let's move on to our other problems, because that should itself be sufficient to show how these internet polemicists, they carry on inventing, concocting, fabricating lies to confuse the vulnerable Muslims who don't do the fact checks at the first instance. Okay, so problem number two, Ur is said to be a Babylonian word meaning city. The origin of the name Ur is not even clear. Some maintain that it is a Sumerian word, Uru, meaning town. Some point to the group of cuneiform symbols in which the Sumerian name is written and translate the name as the place of the dwelling of light. In the Bible, the city is referred to as Ur of the Chaldeans. In Hebrew, it's called Ur Kashdem. Did the Aramaic speaking Midrashic writers confuse the word Ur? Did it actually refer to a city, or meant country, or fire, or light, or flame? Greek Septuagint translates it as a field or a place. Latin Vulgate translates it as fire. Remember, Greek Septuagint is the translation of the Old Testament in Greek, an authoritative translation. And the Latin Vulgate is also an authoritative translation of the Old Testament in Latin. And they translated it differently, as you just heard. Why would these two authoritative versions of the Old Testament translated this way unless they had their source for these interpretive traditions. So this is where the Vulgate text is in Nehemiah 9 verse 7. It talks about the Igni Chaldeorum, translated this as fire. And in the example below, as you can see in the Greek Septuagint, towards the end, it says, from out of the place of the Chaldeans. So it's not simply just saying it is a city, but it's translating this word into a place. So here's the problem. If a particular word is a name, a proper noun, you don't expect it to be translated. Like, for example, name of town, cities, or a person, like name Abraham, should be retained as Abraham everywhere in all the translations that you make, whether it's Aramaic, whether it's Greek. Abraham should be Abraham. You're not going to translate this of a meaning of it, like father of nations. You will keep it the same. So this problem, as you can see now, is confounded if you think Ur is actually a Babylonian word. Now let's move into another problem. Problem number 3. Genesis was not written in Babylonian. It was written in Hebrew. So the word written in Hebrew could well be referring to a place name as well as having the meaning of flame or fire. For a meaning of the name Ur, both the NOBSE, Nobsi Study Bible name list, and the BDB Theological Dictionary propose flame. Jones' Dictionary of Old Testament of the proper names reads light or fire. The redactors of Genesis account may have used this pun to leave it vague. Problem number 4. Genesis text itself is problematic. The mention of Ur of the Chaldeans, or Kasdim, is itself, as scholars argue, anachronistic. The name Chaldeans, as applied to Lower Mesopotamia, does not appear before the 12th century BCE, many hundreds of years after the patriarchs. Paul, interestingly, in Acts, mentions Ur of Chaldeans, another account of anachronistic account. So this is where Paul says, in Acts 7, 2-4, as you can see, he talks about the land of the Chaldeans. Let's move into problem number 5. Genesis is assumed to be authored by Moses. The earliest manuscript of Genesis is 1,000 years after Moses, and even another 1,000 years after Abraham. So it's not a contemporary source of the life of Abraham. Trusting it to be correct is a faith claim, assuming biblical priority, which is not an objective evidence. It's circular reasoning, Mr. Wood. You have to provide evidence for the historicity of Abraham's story in the Old Testament first. If you look at the timeline, as you can see here, Abraham is believed to have lived around this phase that I've shown you in green. Of course, this is not my picture. This is just an image from the internet. And much later, as you can see, the Chaldeans appearing around 1000 BC. I mean, the earliest record that we have is about 1200 BC. So the time lapse itself shows you how far before we are talking about an incident that happened almost 4,000 years ago. And the evidence for this is something that we don't have. The Hebrew manuscripts, the oldest of them being the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated between 250 BCE and 70 CE, but itself misses this portion about Ibrahim or Abraham being saved from the fire, or even of that story. The Aleppo Codex was produced around 930 CE, Christian era, long after Islam. Codex Leningrad dates back to 1009 Christian era, long after Islam. Codex BM or R4445, the London Codex, dates back to 920 or 950 CE. So as you can see from this timeline, the evidence that is used to support the historicity of the story is such late. Now let's move into problem number 6. There are no secular, historical, or archaeological data to corroborate Abraham's story in the Old Testament. Simply there isn't. You have no evidence in your historical record and a secular historical record, and you're using Bible as your evidence. Circular reasoning. Problem number 7. Sources outside the Bible doesn't make it legendary, because there are some sources which are not in the Bible. To give you an example, there are quotations and allusions found in the New Testament from books that have been rejected by Scripture by all. These are neither in the Old Testament nor part of the Old Testament Apocrypha. The two examples I'm showing you in the screen, Jude quotes from Enoch, from the Jewish first book of Enoch, approximately the 1st century BC. And Jude quoted the patriarch Enoch in writing about the return of Christ. Paul, in 2 Timothy, he cites the Assumption of Moses, and he mentions the names of the 2 men who opposed Moses. The names of these men are not recorded in the Old Testament. It is believed they are from the lost work called the Assumption of Moses. So just because you have the Bible, Jude and Luke, as well as Paul mentioning works that are extra biblical, it doesn't make it legendary, and in the 2 examples demonstrates they're believed to be historically correct. Problem number 8. Quran does not mention Ur of the Chaldeans. As you've seen earlier, Quran only talks about how Ibrahim a.s. was saved from the fire. No mentions of Ur, no mentions of Chaldeans. So as you can see, the whole story is built upon what? Built upon layers of storytelling elements. That's all. Now, we are now going to move into corroboration of the Quranic narrative, and we will talk about, are there documentary evidence of this motive of Abraham being saved from the fire? Are there early multiple attestation? Number 2, could the authors of Genesis have left account for a reason? Number 3, are there any evidence of the motive of punishing with fire in ancient Mesopotamia? Number 4, what about other recently corroborated motives, like the astral triad, issues about the distinction between Pharaoh and king, the cities of Iram and Abla, going into other corroborative motives? And lastly, number 5, the concept of wahy. Okay, so let's move on to number 1, corroboration about documentary evidence of this motive of Abraham being saved from the fire, other than the account in Genesis. If we look into some examples, like Pseudo-Philo. Pseudo-Philo is an anonymous work, dated variously to 200 BCE to 200 CE, which also talks about Abraham being cast into a fiery furnace. We have accounts also in Philo, who was the epic poet from 3rd to 2nd century BC. Philo the Elder is the author of the Greek epic entitled On Jerusalem. Of the original lengthy work, only 24 lines survive, preserved in the Eusebius Preparatio Evangelica 921. Various commentators have seized upon the highlighted phrase as a reference to God's stopping of the sacrifice of Isaac or the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But it may well be that the immolation in question was the burning of Abraham in a fiery furnace. If so, then this motive would arguably go back to the 2nd century BCE, and this is what Google talks about. We also have in Isaiah the motive, where Abraham being redeemed. Redeem means, as Google explains, not only bought back, but ransomed or rescued from captivity. These words of Isaiah might thus be seen to suggest that in telling Abraham to leave Ur, God had in fact rescued him, taking him out of some difficult or dangerous situation. This is what Google is saying. You can read Google's work in this book. Also, in the book of Jubilees that we alluded earlier, dated to 160 to 150 BC, it's called Lesser Genesis or Leptogenesis. It's an ancient Jewish religious work, about 50 chapters. But the point we want to make is it is considered canonical by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Canonical by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, as well as Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews, where it is known as the Book of Division, or Ge'ez. Not only that, it is cited as an authority by one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Sectarian Dead Sea Scrolls, the Cairo-Damascus 16.3-4, as well as what we mentioned earlier about the Vulgate, which talked about the fire of the Chaldeans. Let's move on to number 2. Could the authors of Genesis have left out this account for a reason? So I want to share with you from this work by Jakovich from Hebrew University, The Exodus from Ur of the Chaldeans, a chapter in literary archaeology. This is what Professor Jakovich says, I quote, "On the other hand, perhaps the opposite is correct. An ancient story about Abraham and Haran, which for certain reasons was rejected by the writers of Genesis, left its imprint instead in Daniel 3, where its storyline was recycled, but later found its way into pseudo-apocrypha and rabbinic literature." See, Professor Jakovich of Hebrew University, he's following the scholar Umberto Cassuto, demonstrated that the tradition of Haran's death in the fire and Abraham's rescue from it was known to the writer of the priestly document, who nonetheless decided to reject it from his document. This tradition also left its imprint on Daniel 3 and on post-biblical literature. And in order to make his point, he addresses 2 issues. First, he provides evidence for the antiquity of the rejected tradition, and secondly, explains why the priestly writer would have rejected it. So I highly recommend those who are interested go to look at Professor Jakovich's article. For example, here he talks about how the word Dora, a place name in Daniel, is translated in Codex Venetus of the Septuagint as bonfire, and he compares it with other accounts as pile the wood under it and blaze. Rashi and Kimhi on Ezekiel as well as the Septuagint reflect similar understanding of the meaning of the word. This evidence, he says, suggests that the name, the plain of Dora, was intended to carry a double meaning, or with the meaning of plain, but also the meaning of fire derived from the story of Abraham and Ur. So here he gives you an example of how the writers of Genesis have used a literary device to use a word which has a double meaning, an intended pun, to make a point. And moving on to corroboration of Quranic narrative. Number 3, are there any evidence of motive of punishing people with fire in ancient Mesopotamia? Now, this is a paper by Elena Popa from the University of Bucharest, Burn the Witch, the Enemy and the Evildoer, Punishment with Fire in Ancient Mesopotamia, in which she documents various examples of this motif of burning people with fire in ancient Mesopotamia. Burning people in the fire is a well-established motive in ancient Mesopotamia. The Code of Hammurabi for example, which is a Babylonian legal text composed around 1755 to 1750 BC, prescribes punishment with burning. For example, the codes, two codes that I've shown you on the screen, code number 25 and 157, and various others. Death by fire before the first millennium BC is also known from the documents found in Mari. The punishment of burning as a result of treason by burning the guilty together with his family, for example. And you can see that in this paper, The Punishment of Burning in the Hebrew Bible by Shaul Bar from the University of Memphis. Now, let's move on to number 4. Corroboration of the Quranic narratives by other motifs that are found around that region, around that time. The examples I'm going to show you on the screen is about the astral triad the people of the time of Abraham worshipped. They didn't just worship just any elements. There was an astral triad, and this is wonderfully explained by our brother Abu Zakaria in his Many Prophets One Message YouTube channel in a video, Quran and the Secrets of Babylon, where you can actually see how the Quran gives you a clear picture of how or what people worshipped around that time, instead of what vague references that you find in the Bible, for example. What about the story of kings and pharaohs the Quran mentions during the time of Joseph, Yusuf alayhi salam, and Moses, Musa alayhi salam? As you can see, the Quran makes a distinction between the titles of the kings or the monarchs at that time, whether it was a king or a pharaoh. And you can see how the Quran uses these terms accurately and appropriately at those time frame. And you can find this again in a wonderful presentation by Brother Abu Zakaria in his channel. And the video is called The Quran and the Secrets of Egypt. So I highly recommend you to watch this. Other examples can be given. I mean, there's many examples we can bring. The issues of Iram. Iram was a city that was unknown to history until, quite some time ago, when we discovered the cuneiform tablets in the city of Abla, in Tel Marduk. Before that, people thought this was a historical fable or a legend mentioned in the Quran. There's no existence of it. But after this discovery, now it has become a historical place. Just to demonstrate to you how again and again the Quran gives you historical data accurately, so that in later times, even people making allegations against the Quran saying this is a historical legend was then forced to admit and acknowledge the veracity, the correctness of the Quranic accounts, the Quranic narratives. So now, in conclusion then, I just want to summarize what we have seen so far in this deep dive in an argument that's been presented by this popular apologist. I want to make, firstly, an important point to our Muslim audience. As you've realized, because many of you don't do fact checks, you can be easily a victim of those storytellers who concoct stories, who gives you account which is based on circular reasoning and based on a biblical priority, and then they make a case, and you for some reason think that this is correct because they are eloquent in their presentation. As you've realized, a simple fact check on this issue demonstrated how the story is concocted based on their particular agenda to confuse these Muslims. So my question would be, why are you even engaging in consuming the materials when you even don't do the basic fact checks? So I want to now summarize. So we showed how the arguments provided by our critics rests on faulty and circular reasoning by appealing and assuming the biblical account to be true when there is no objective reason to do so. Neither is there any objective evidence to believe it to be correct. Not only that, we showed how the argument is itself a concocted story by Wood or his sources. In addition, the biblical text suffers from historical anachronism. The biblical account itself doesn't have any historical backing for 2,000 years, with a lack of documentary evidence for itself, as well as from secular data. We showed how the Genesis writers used the word as a pun to supply double meanings. And we showed that the scholars have shown that the Genesis writers have left the account out, and there are reasons that exist for this exclusion. We then showed how the Quranic account can be corroborated from the Bible itself, as well as ancient history, and why the Quranic data is more reasonable to believe based on recent archaeological findings. Finally, the Quran is a revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that can be objectively demonstrated. Hence, we don't need to care if there is absence of biblical or secular data or existence of extra-biblical data in line with the Quranic narratives. We affirm it due to knowledge from revelation from God. Finally, this video has demonstrated how weak and invalid the argument or criticism is by people like Wood and others when they argue against the Quran. All it needs is a simple fact check.